Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please smash that subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate small amount given in the link in the description box. But the least you could do is to watch this show, like, share, and comment. Without further ado, let me welcome our guest tonight, Professor Cornel West. Professor West is an American philosopher, theologian, political activist, politician, social critic, and an author. Professor West was an independent candidate in the 2024 United States presidential election and is an important voice in left-wing politics, not just in the United States, but across the world. Professor West, welcome to Indian Global Left. It's been such a pleasure. It's a pleasure to have you on.
My brother, it is my blessing and joy to be here. My beloved wife, Anahita, and I watch you regularly to get a serious left analysis and vision of the world. And I salute you. And I believe in the depths of my heart, though, man, that you're a force for good in a lot of different ways.
Thank you so much. I wanted to discuss politics, but I wanted to start with certain philosophical questions that I've been trying to understand, wrapping my head around. And if we could start with your thoughts on the concept, the idea, or even the process called democracy. I read your book, Democracy Matters. And the kind of things that you spoke about, US militarism, corporate oligopoly, religious fundamentalism, and how these things have hollowed out what you call the American democracy. Um, I was wondering, why did Professor West not wrap these things around the word justice and instead use the title democracy? Because living under electoral democracy in India, seeing what has been happening in the United States, I find it hard to think the word democracy or the process democracy in a very substantive way if it is devoid of justice. So, what is this link between justice and democracy, and why did you choose to write a book titled Democracy Matters?
Well, very kind of you to even mention that book was published 21 years ago. My God. And of course, I could have been writing last night in terms of the organized greed and weaponized hatred and routinized indifference toward the weak and vulnerable that we're seeing in fascist America. But see, I think the important thing for me, my brother, is that I come out of the Black freedom struggle. And the Black freedom struggle primarily uses the word freedom, very much like the Marxist tradition. See, there's no Marxist tradition of talking about justice. You hardly get the word justice in Marx's whole corpus. He talks about freedom, partly because of Hegelian influence, but partly because freedom is much more encompassing. Justice has been primarily a discourse tied to liberal and neoliberal and social democratic regimes. And that's fine because justice has its role. Justice has deep roots, of course, in Hebrew scripture. Justice, you should do justice in that regard. But freedom is very different because when you look at the world from the vantage point of being enslaved, degraded, and demeaned, they haven't once humanity radically called into question, then the issues of trying to get free from those lies and free from that psychic tyranny goes hand in hand with struggling for social freedom and economic freedom and civic freedom. And so democracy becomes a secondary term that has to do with how does, out of self-respect and self-determination and self-defense, do you attempt to create conceptions of society in which people hold the power? And that's democracy, the rule of the demos, of those Sly Stone called everyday people. James Cleveland, the great gospel singer, called them ordinary people. Shiloh said, for God's sake, we got to give more power to the people. The Black Panther Party said, power to the people, so that freedom is at the center, though, brother. That's why love is so important for the Black freedom movement, see, because there is no emancipation from white supremacist lies about yourself, let alone the connections of white supremacy to predatory capitalism, the empirical tendencies around the world, tentacles around the world. But there's no possibility of joining a freedom movement if you're not free from white supremacist lies and free from predatory capitalist sensibilities. So that it's spiritual and psychic, You then join freedom movement, and the first question you raise is control over the police, control over the mechanisms of repression, controls of the workplace, and controls over your community. So the Black Freedom Movement has never really fit fully within any of the isms of the West or the isms of the U.S. mainstream, but the rule of the people, people's having control, democratic control, social control, public control. Those are the things that resonate with me, and that's why I've ended up being a part of the Democratic Socialist movement, going all the way back to DSA in 1982. What is that? 43 years, and I was there with Michael Harrington and the great Stanley Aronowitz and Barbara Ehrenreich and Bogdan Dick Dinich and so many others who were coming at it from their vantage point. The Manny Marable and I were coming at it, Sister Paula and the others, we coming at it through the Black Freedom Movement. And of course, as you know, that's what my campaign was about, you see. My campaign was about what? The abolition of poverty, the abolition of ICE, the breakup of monopolies and finance, the breakup of monopolies in big tech, the breakup of monopolies in industry. Well, see, that's people's control. That's democratic control. Now, Debs talked about it in terms of what? Nationalization of industry. That's his language, because that was the old language. But nationalization could easily be couched in such a way that the people themselves no longer have voices. But nationalization still makes sense when it's understood as a form of public control or social control or people's control. But if you're not dealing with the other dimensions of the legacy of white supremacy, though, brother, then from my point of view, I'm going to have a critique. And that's always been, my critique of my dear brother Bernie Sanders, or even now my dear brother Soran Kwame. Mom, Tommy, I always like to get that Kwame in there, because you can't speak to the needs of the community that produced me, of African peoples, Black peoples. And you understand this in India in relation to Dalits as well, right? Just talking about class ain't gonna deal with the issue of Dalits. Of course, you got to deal with the poverty. Of course, you got to deal with the wealth inequality and so forth. But you also got to deal with the psychic freedom for precious Dalits as they attempt to overcome Brahmin supremacy and so forth and so on. So these are the things that have always moved me, and that was at work in that Democracy Matters. Because as you know, that was volume 2. You got Race Matters and you got Democracy Matters. Both of them being inextricably tied together, in no way being identical, but deeply being inseparable.
I wonder how you have been thinking or seeing this debate about identity as a tool for mobilization. I mean, there has been a debate going on within the left whether that's effective or not. I mean, there are sections of those on the left who have completely given up on the identity question, and I don't think that's helpful at all. But for those of us who think that it's a very critical issue, there's still a question that remains about strategies of mobilization. In India, for instance, Dalit thinker Anand Teltumre says that on one hand, it becomes an effective tool. Dalit mobilization itself becomes a very effective tool to fight Brahminism. On the other hand, it can trap you or move you away from the whole project of what is called as annihilation of caste in India, because the mobilization itself comes in the form of caste. And I assume it's the same when it comes to race. So as someone on the left and as someone coming from the Black tradition, how do you feel seeing these debates? On one hand, they lapse into very reductive binaries. Your own interview with, I think it was Jimmy Dore, which was so frustrating given there was this denial of even accepting that race matters. And on the other hand, it's indeed a serious question. It's not as juvenile as it is sometimes made out to be within university campuses. So I would like to hear your thoughts about what is your reflection on these debates that we are seeing around.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that question too, brother. First, let's just begin on a basic level that every human being has a set of identities. And one of the most fundamental human identities is the desire for protection, the desire for association, and the desire for recognition. People are going to resonate in contexts where they feel protected, beginning with mom and daddy and family and community and so forth. The desire for recognition. People feel as if they have a sense of belonging, they're being accepted, they're being embraced. And then the denial of association, feeling as if by being in this particular group, that one's life can more readily flower and flourish. So that protection, association, and recognition is going to circulate in a lot of different ways under specific historical circumstances. Now, when you've been shaped, let's say in the United States and the US empire, by a chronic and barbaric white supremacist civilization, enslaved for 244 years and neo-slavery for another 100 years, and every 2.5 days a black man, a woman, a child is lynched, then the protection that you go for is going to be in a community that provides that. And given the segregated conditions, of course, race is going to have weight. Now, we know race has no scientific content as a concept, but it's lived, it's legalized and institutionalized into ways of life. Same is true with recognition. Who's going to recognize your humanity? And who will you associate yourself with in order to get the protection? So that in that sense, race is always going to have a major weight in any white supremacist society. Same would do with Dalit and Brahma society and so on. And I would say same thing about patriarchy and what have you. But it's not this little cheap, superficial, milquetoast identity politics associated with liberal and neoliberal politics that just mobilizes these communities in order to defend capital, in order to divide and conquer. So you can't get a united working class. You can't get united peoples who are being economically exploited by bosses. And same would be true on an international arena in terms of colonized people. And Fanon and a whole host of others, have taught us this. The great Du Bois taught us this very well. So that the question becomes then, when we talk about any kind of mobilization, any sets of strategies and tactics, what are the underlying visions and analysis that inform those strategies and tactics? That's why Fanon could rightly argue, of course, you got to organize as a nation against imperialist folk from outside. But once you push them out, then you got class struggles still going on. You end up with neo-colonial elites, often in alliance with international capital, to subjugate those formerly colonized subjects and make them workers, and they remain poor as the neo-colonial bourgeoisies flourish. So that each context has to be analyzed in light of that particular, what Gramsci would call the historical conjuncture. And so in that sense, I've never really participated in the little identity politics dialogue. And that's why I was very critical of, brothers like Coates and others who I respect and raising their voices. But anytime you fetishize white supremacy and can't connect it and ground it in predatory capitalist modes of production and in imperial tentacles of those capitalist societies, then you're going to end up just bringing folk into liberal regimes and neoliberal regimes and end up with black faces in high places, whereas the masses of black folk continue to live lives of ruin and disaster. That's the language of Marcus Garvey. And I'm very critical of Garvey's imperial sensibilities and very critical of Garvey's refusal to confront capitalism. But when he says the masses of black people will live lives of ruin and disaster in the United States, and the major problem with black people is disorganization, Garvey's been right about that. I just have a very different kind of much more what people would call leftist analysis of that. But I try to look at the world through the vantage point of my own community that produced me. I'm from the chocolate side of Sacramento. I come out of the West household with Irene and Cliff and Cynthia Share. I come out of Shiloh Baptist Church where you had pastors who loved the people. The Black Panther Party was right next door, deeply shaped by the Black Panther Party, and has tried to be true to my understanding of what it is to be a human being, a black man, a New World African, dealing with vicious bombardment of white supremacy, and the capitalist exploitation and the ways in which that has shaped the whole world in the image of capitalist European and transatlantic societies, and what forms of resistance can be put forward that's tied to reverence something bigger than just the ego of leaders or anybody else, and tied to resemblance of the great ones who came before, who tried to tell the truth.
One of the things that sometimes disturb me about conversations within the United States about the Black tradition is that the radical traditions that we have seen recently, I mean, to the extent they can be called radical, but let's call them radical for now. I'm talking about the Sanders movement and all the strands that participated to create the Sanders movement. I'm not necessarily thinking about Bernie Sanders, but the bottom-up movement that joined to make that movement, or recently we are seeing in New York. One of the narratives is that the Black tradition is missing, or at least missing as a Black tradition within it. We had Professor Gerald Horne, and we discussed this history of how the Black tradition has been, radical tradition has been smashed, the Black Panther Party going back. So I just wanted to ask you, as a thinker from within the tradition, how do you look at the present brand of radical tradition for, or the present manifestations of that Black radical tradition? Because it just disturbs me when people say that all that the Black tradition is left with now is the affirmative action or DEI, or just capitulate to the establishment Democratic Party. It's very hard to imagine that way. So what would be some of the radical traditions that you still are hopeful about?
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed, indeed. Well, one, I just want to salute my dear brother Gerald Horne. He's one of the great historians alive. He looks at the world precisely through the lens that I attempt to look at the world. He's my dear brother. He's my dear comrade. And he's been consistent. He's been constant in his radical vision. But there are other radical thinkers out there. Brother Robin Kelly is a serious radical thinker in that regard. Um, but it's true that the Black radical tradition right now is very weak. There's no doubt about it. It's very weak. That it's the so many of the movements and the leaders underwent literal assassination, underwent incarceration. Mumia Abu-Jamal is one of the great Black radical voices, still alive, but he's been incarcerated now for over 3 decades. He's my dear brother. I was blessed to write prefaces to his powerful books. Uh, um, but the assassination, the incarnation, the enjailment and the imprisonment of so many of our leaders, and then the smears that have been put forward because they're so utopian, they're so far removed from the realm of possibility. So that the legacies of the Paul Robesons and the legacies of the Du Boises and the Ella Bakers and the Fannie Lou Hamers and others get pushed aside. I mean, Barbara Ransby's great book on Ella Baker is a grand example of that. And Barbara, in her own way, is a part of the Black radical tradition, even though sometimes we have a number of disagreements. Uh, but for me, it's just a matter of truth, freedom, and justice. That is to say, you got to just tell the truth. And no matter how weak your movement is, you still must tell the truth. That was true with Obama. People were trying to make him out as if he was some grand exemplar. Even Sister Angela Davis said he's part of Black radical tradition. Angela, we love you. You've been magnificent. You've been courageous. But you're wrong on this. He ain't part of no Black radical tradition. He's just another Black neoliberal that's going to capitulate and cower and defer to Wall Street and big tech and push through his imperial policies with what 6, 7 wars at the same time, 25,000 bombs dropped and got a peace prize. Hey, we got to tell the truth. People thought that during those times was Brother Tavis Smiley and myself were going through poverty tours, critical of Obama, critical of the drones, critical of the wars. That somehow it was just a matter of personal animus. No, we were trying to keep alive the best of a black radical tradition that has been, there's attempts to push it underground. And it's no accident that when Occupy hit about 14 years ago, and then Brother Bernie hit, they hit in such a way that their social base was not the most radical the most radical community in the American empire, which is the black community. The black community had been put to sleep by neoliberal black leaders like Obama and company. And so Bernie comes along with his marvelous critique of Wall Street greed, his marvelous critique of grotesque wealth inequality, but he basically had New Deal liberal programs, and in some sense, moving toward Great Society programs of LBJ. He didn't run on a socialist platform. He knows that. I was with him both campaigns. We talked about it all the time. And when you were a socialist platform is a platform of the breakup of monopolies. It's people's control of industry and finance and big tech and the workplace. Rick Wolf, another towering socialist Marxist economist, understands this in terms of workplace, what workers control over the workplace. But you also have to connect it to the struggle against white supremacy. That myself and Nina Turner and others, we were unsuccessful in trying to break the bond between black neoliberal leadership and black people, because so many of everyday black people have given up on the system just a long time ago. I've taught in prison for 47 years. And most of the brothers there just they see through the corruption. They see through all of the manipulation and hypocrisy. They don't participate. They don't believe there is, in fact, any kind of serious alternative that could work. And therefore they got to hustle and so forth, but they're not going to participate and be complicitous with the corruption. And so Bernie's campaign, which is very important, but his social base was not the black community. He had slices, voices like myself, but it was not the black community. And what did that mean? That meant that he wasn't going to talk too much about police. Now, many of us went to jail. I was blessed to go to jail with Carl Dick's Revolutionary Communist Party and Jim Fredos and a whole host of others over stop and frisk and the police here in New York. That's 14 years ago. And that was under Bloomberg. Obama came to New York and said, Bloomberg's the best mayor I know. How's he going to be the best mayor you know? And he's putting black and brown men and women, especially black and brown brothers, in jail by the thousands. Was because they don't count. And you see, and that's always a sign. You see, genocide in Gaza, Palestinians don't count. Land dispossession in the West Bank, stealing land. You see it in no other land. This film, they don't count in the discourse. New York Times is the same way. Poor black people don't count. They're concerned about the black middle class. They're concerned about the black leaders. They're concerned about those who already participate in the mainstream liberal and neoliberal discourse, you see. And so you're absolutely right. When my dear brother Saran comes along, and he's a brilliant brother. I mean, I never met him, but I like him. His father, of course, is a crucial voice in terms of anti-colonial struggles in Africa, was pushed out by gangster Idi Amin, who was tied to the CIA and had his own forms of repression against the left. Then his mother, a marvelous artist and director and so forth. But what do you see? Well, with Brother Saran, you get this mobilization in part of Bernie's camp, but even more, but is still unable to move into the black community in a deep way. Why? What does he have to say about the police? Well, Jessica Tisch, what? Surveillance state? Providing data to Trump's administration for ICE? What are we talking about? Open to stop and frisk? What are we talking about? Family real estate developers, and you supposed to be critical of the real estate developers' greed? Come on, brother Saran. From the vantage point of the Black Freedom Movement, and I was, of course, a very strong supporter of the brother, but always with a critique, because the problem is, you see, if you look at America through the lens primarily of voluntary immigrants, brother, you're going to have a settler mentality. And his base, who are very often significant gentrifiers, have a gentrifier sensibility. So when you get up, you give a speech, and you start off with Debs, and that was beautiful. I love Eugene Debs. Debs is my brother now. Oh, there, as long as there is a lower class, I am of it. As long as there's a criminal element, I am in it. As long as there's a soul in prison, I am free. That's Debs, 1920. No, it's 1918 when he gave that great speech. But Deb's calling for the nationalization of industry. So, I mean, you know, ain't got nothing to do with it. So Ron's project now, it ain't freezing the rent and free buses fast and all that. No, Debs was a socialist. Let's just be honest about that. So was Norman Thomas. So was my dear brother Michael Harrington calling for the socialization of industry and public ownership and so forth. So you get Brother Soran gets out there. What does he say? He says, America, New York is a city of immigrants. No, it's not, man. Don't tell that lie. New York was built by immigrants. No, it wasn't. Immigrants played an important role in building it, but it wasn't built by them. First, you had to have the land, genocide, indigenous peoples. Then you had to have the economic foundation of your national economy, which was slavery of Black people. Those are fundamental factors, elements, features of the building of New York. Now, of course, then the immigrants, the voluntary ones. And of course, keep in mind, my brother, that Saran and his own family wouldn't even be here if it wasn't for the Black Freedom Movement, because 1965 was the Immigration Act that, what does it do? It pushed back the White Supremacist Act of 1924 that confined to Northern and Western Europeans that said, open it up to the world. It's going to be based on both skill and family ties and no longer race and ethnicity. That's the Black Freedom Movement that did that. That's precisely how the colorful immigrants and all of their marvelousness and beauty and wonderfulness. I'm glad they're here. I'm glad Saran is here. I'm glad his mom and daddy's here. I'm glad all the different folk are here, from Muslims and Christians and atheists and so forth. But not to be able to see the Black Freedom Movement made that possible. And then to end up with saying, no, this is the moment for immigrants. Hey, wait a minute. Wait a minute. Watch your language, man. Watch your language. Slave ships, barbaric slave ships going to barbaric slave auctions on the way to barbaric slave plantations, not immigrants. If you can't keep track of the doings and sufferings of those particular precious people, Black people, African people, then something's missing. Then you wonder why the Black community is not breakdancing for you. Of course, they pick up the settler sensibility. They pick up the gentrifier sensibility, but they still voted 57% because they had no alternative. And I was still supporting Brother Saran because I know that, you know, of course, he's an anti-racist. We know that. Bernie's anti-racist, but Bernie could not highlight the plight of Black folk in that way. And that's one of the things that we were able to do in the campaign. We just couldn't take off because we're in at a moment of ascending neo-fascism that was just so powerful that people were not interested in a left alternative. They were trying to support the war criminality of the Democratic Party and the war criminality of Kamala Harris. So genocide was something you could just overlook. Anybody that supports genocide has no moral authority whatsoever. Let's just be clear about that. And there's other reasons why. We could talk about Haiti and, of course, what's happening right now in Sudan and the AFRICOM and things. And thank God for the Black Agenda Report with Brother Anthony, Sister Margaret, and the others who are trying to keep track of it. The great legacy of Glenn Ford, who I used to meet every month and engage in fascinating dialogue. I take a bullet for him, he take a bullet for me. He's much more of a secular revolutionary brother, and I'm more a revolutionary Christian, but we loved each other and always will. But that's, for me, crucial in terms of trying to keep track of the truth, brother. And the condition of truth is to allow the suffering to speak. Across the board, immigrant suffering, absolutely. Indeed, working class, absolutely. But if you're not including the whole group of people who are suffering, especially Black folk, you're going to end up with a truncated project. And so I think Saran is early enough in his in the process for him to learn and to respond, because he's a brilliant brother. I think he's got a very decent heart and so forth. But all of us are shaped by our context. All of us are shaped by our situations. And it's not just him. I think it's true for so-called democratic socialists. I say so-called because I mean, so much of democratic socialism these days is really New Deal liberalism and great society liberalism, strong social democratic programs that I do support, but it's not socialist in the sense that people in the larger, what Brother Norman Finkelstein calls the historic left. Brother Norman, he's right about that now. The historic left. Capitalism cannot satisfy basic needs: food, housing, jobs with a living wage, safe communities, and so forth. And you have to be critical of those who come up with strategies and tactics that just reinforce it, even though all of us end up supporting reform as a way of calling for more fundamental transformation. And then what do you end up with? Well, for me, you don't just end up with an ism. I've always been in a democratic socialist organization, but it's not just an ism. It's a love and commitment to the welfare of the least of these, of poor and working people, and ensure that they are at the center, not oligarchs, not plutocrats, not stock market, but working people's and poor people's conditions and circumstances. That's at the center. And that's a moral and a spiritual issue for me. It really is.
I'm just stock taking on the time I have given. I have so many questions, but I'm very tempted to ask a quick question on this segment before moving to
You
the
ask any
next.
question you like, my brother.
Yes,
We got
no,
time.
that's
Don't
of
worry
course.
about it. Don't
Oh,
worry about it.
yeah. So I've been thinking about your comment on freedom, and it's absolutely true that most oppressed communities, the Dalits, the blacks in the United States, and we can think about many more. Uh,
Indigenous peoples. Yes,
Yes,
yes, yes.
freedom. The word, the freedom has been the most central axis of mobilization because, given the immediate experience, is that of oppression.
That's right.
That's absolutely true. That said, I'm also aware that the word freedom, like you pointed out about justice, that justice can be thought about in very narrow political terms, but we have the more comprehensive understanding of social justice. Likewise, freedom has been misused and abused in all kinds of ways. For neoliberals, freedom is mostly corporate freedom. Those
That's right.
of us focusing on international political economy, the word freedom has been mostly about international finance to move in and move out. And that's why China is authoritarian. I mean, one of the primary reasons for that is because there is strict capital control. We can think about the far right movement where freedom is something completely different. And they are also mobilizing people in many ways. There are political participations in fascistic movements. So I'm trying to think through with you that when it comes to the totality of things, freedom is going to be limited. It cannot be, one can think about free speech, and I understand that that can be unlimited for everyone, barring a very small set of things, maybe. But in all kinds of other things, for instance, for those of us on the left, we know that freedom from property is always going to be limited. And so a billionaire amassing whole kinds of land, I mean, whole estates and estates of real estate, means that there's going to be homeless because land effectively is limited. So when we are trying to think of freedom in a comprehensive way, there's going to be restrictions. And when you come to that questions of what is an effective restriction, what is fair and what is not, then I tend to fall back again and again of question about what is fair and what is not fair, going back to all the philosophers from Adam Smith to, I mean, you can name it. And so the question of justice comes up again and again. So if we throw that away, then what are the bases on which we would evaluate that what kind of freedom is something legitimate and what kind of freedom is not legitimate?
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's a deep philosophical question, my brother. No doubt about that. Very much so. But first, let's begin where you began, namely that when you've been enslaved or when you've been taught to hate yourself, then that's a certain kind of tyranny. It's a certain kind of bondage, a certain kind of enslavement. And to come from that vantage point means freedom is going to be much more weighty than justice. Because you can have a just wage in the Marxist sense, and it's a joke. Because if the whole system is based on domination and exploitation, then it's just a matter of a certain kind of fairness relative to an unjust system of domination. You can treat a enslaved brother or sister justly on the plantation, but as long as they own the plantation, they still slaves. So do you see how justice is always context dependent? And you need a notion that calls into question the system itself. And so, and there's no accident that justice, going back to both the Greeks and the Romans, let's say in the West, is represented by blindness, right? By blindness. Freedom's not about blindness, man. You got to be able to see the domination. You got to be able even to imagine the domination. Just Stout, my dear brother, makes the point. It's a powerful point. Even people who are potentially able to be dominated are still not free. Why? Because you can see these genuine, actual possibilities of subjugation and domination. And so, again, Marx gets this from Hegel, and I think it's a real insight that we're really talking about the preciousness of individuality that's always tied to community, so that individuals are able to live lives of flourishing and flowering when they're in societies and communities where they have access to resources, access to forms of recognition and self-respect, and access to self-confidence and control over their institutions that shape their destiny. See, that's freedom. Now, I was blessed to study under a towering figure, John Rawls, who wrote that classic text that I know you wrestled with, right? I can see it right now, sitting on the front row listening to his lectures. I can imagine, I'd see myself right now in his living room with Sister Ann, his wife. He was my dear brother. We fought over this all the time because he comes out of a liberal tradition where justice is the fundamental notion. And we said, well, Professor Rawls, what about freedom? Well, I had read Marx. It's only one footnote to Avenari's books on Marx and the whole book. Josh Cohen and the others put this pressure on. Now, Rawls was kind enough to say, maybe I should read Marx. He read Marx one summer in German, 4 major texts, German ideology and others. And he came back and he said, he lives in a world alien to me. He was very honest because it's all talk about freedom. It's all about collective freedom, social freedom, control over the modes of production and so forth and so on. And, people say, well, it's authoritarian and it's fascist, it's the road to serfdom and so forth. There's no doubt that that collective control can itself lead toward elite control, like party control. If people don't have control over the party, then you end up with another form of elite control. There's no doubt about that. It's subject to abuse. Now, all of these notions, my brother, are subject to manipulation and abuse. Freedom, justice, liberty probably is the language much more of conservatives. If you go back to Edmund Burke, you recall, he's much more talking about ordered liberty. And he's concerned about the slide to licentiousness. Whereas freedom early on was much more of a different kind of discourse. I think much more tied to left at that time. But you can see how all these notions get appropriated in a variety of different ways. So conservatives end up talking about, Milton Friedman talked about economic freedom. Well, he's really talking about liberty for individuals. He's not talking about freedom for communities who are working class, poor, and so forth and so on. See? But what he didn't see, of course, was the ways in which the concentration of power in the private sector could lead toward very atrocious forms of not just exploitation, but domination too. Hayek says the road to serfdom. He thinks it's only one road. There's a whole lot of roads to serfdom. And that's one of the points that the Marxian tradition and the socialist tradition understands. But you have to dip it in the experience of people's historical context. And that's where white supremacy and male supremacy plays an important role. And that's why we defend our precious gays and lesbian and trans too, because these are both moral issues and they also are tied to certain forms of tyranny vis-a-vis their lived experience. But if you're stuck only there, then you don't get to the capitalist mode of production. You don't get to imperialism. So it's going to be hard to understand what's happening in the genocide in Gaza and why the United States and European countries are authorizing and sponsoring this barbaric genocide and ethnic cleansing and apartheid rule and so on. You got to be able to tell that full truth. And to tell the full truth means we're critical of ourselves because we're all shaped by the very things we're talking about.
I just wanted to reference for our viewers on Raoul's theory of justice, also Amartya Sen's idea of justice, written
Yeah.
as a response to Rawls' theory of justice, and is much more comprehensive in many ways because it takes into account Oriental traditions, or let me call the Asian and Global South traditions, Buddhist traditions, ancient Indian philosophy, Chinese traditions, also much deeper engagements with gender, and somewhat of an engagement with the Marxist tradition, although not very adequately. Of course, there is no substantive engagement with the Dalit tradition and the Black tradition. Again,
Oh, and Betker, where's that Betker and his
yes.
legacy?
So that's
You're right. You're right.
obviously missing
You're right.
links.
No, but
I
since shift to talk about capabilities and the various ways in which you build up capabilities, it is a way of dealing with historically specific context. Rawls is dealing with abstract criteria in the Kantian tradition. And so you really have very different ways. I'm much more with sin, as you can imagine. But we read both of them closely to see, what deep insights and see what limitations they both have. But I'm glad
right.
you raised the great sin.
Yeah, here was
Definitely.
this beautiful example about a flute and three child making a claim each. The first says that the wood comes from my father's forest, so I should have this. The other says that I am the best player of the flute, so it should be given to me. And the third says that I can never afford it, and so it should be given to me. And these are like three different traditions: the libertarian tradition, the utilitarian tradition, and the kind of socialist egalitarian tradition. And Sen says that it's very difficult to answer in one way until you have further data about what kind of utility object is this flute. Is it like basic education? Is it like astronomy? And it really boils down to this more and more data to eventually come to a single answer if you want it. Or else the idea of justice has a sort of multiple dimension tied to it.
That's very true, though, brother. That's very true. I mean, the challenge is that you started with strategy and tactics. We used to say years ago that if poor and working people could vote their way into freedom for them, the ruling class would make voting illegal. And there is something to that. You have to use the electoral system, but it's just so narrow and hollowed out and truncated and so dominated by big money that both parties are just so corrupt. And if you can't come up with some alternative, then you're going to continually produce these figures who disappoint the people because either they end up just selling out. And I don't think that Brother Serrano is just going to sell out. I don't think that he's that kind of brother, but I think he's going to end up so well adjusted and so well adapted to a status quo that is built on the back of the very people that he's concerned about, that he won't be able to maneuver in a way he likes. Many of us were there with David Dinkins. David Dinkins was also a member of DSA. He wasn't the kind of radical brother that he wasn't as radical as Soron, and Soron's not that radical, but he's more radical than David Dinkins, believe me. And but David Dinkins used to say every Monday he'd meet with the permanent government of New York. And the permanent government of New York was Wall Street, was big business. And they just let him know, look, we leaving, brother. If you think about any kind of serious, progressive program were leaving the city. And you say, well, call them out, man. You know, that's how you deal with bullies. That's how you deal with Trump. Trump act like he's so bad. And I like that with brothers surround with Trump. You just call him out. This is what I believe. This is what I'm doing. You're not my primary point of reference. I'm not a parasite on your host. I'm loving these people. I'm fighting for these people, period. All you're going to do is crush me or kill me or whatever. I'm going down. Hey, what else you going to do? But Dinkins, he got soft quick, man. He would think about a re-election and still got beat by the Giuliani. But it was that permanent government, and that permanent government is something else, man. That big business is something else. But you have to tell people the truth about it. Don't lie to the people. This is what Cabral said, right? Don't claim no easy victories. Don't tell no lies. Tell the people the truth. This is what I'm trying to do. I'm not able to do it. We understand. We understand. But I just don't want, the larger public to think that socialism is just about, free buses and 5 grocery stores by the government and so forth. Now, socialism is about breaking up these monopolies. It's getting right at the heart of the capitalist mode of production. And we can talk about it, and we can't generate any possibility at the moment, but you have to be honest about it. You know what I mean? You just have to be honest about it. Just like a Christian. Christian about following Jesus and being willing to die. It ain't going to church and paying a little money and going back to be the same gangster-like person you've been. No, you got to tell the truth. Being a Marxist is about revolutionary transformation of a capitalist mode of production that is exploitative and cannot satisfy the basic needs of the people. That's the standard. Don't bring the standard down just because everything has moved so far to the right. Truth is not like that. Freedom is not like that. Integrity is not like that. Love is not like that. And that's the crucial thing, brother. You got to love the people, man. That's Malcolm and Martin and Ella Baker, Curtis Mayfield, Nina Simone, brother. You got to love the people and be willing to tell the truth and be willing to die for them. That's the best of the Black freedom movement. And that's what we don't have. But I think it's going to bounce back. I do. It's going to bounce. I was just with an emoji group, 2,500 precious young Black kids, and they tied to solidarity. What's happening in Gaza, they tied to solidarity. But even poor whites in Kentucky, they tied to solidarity with landless peasants in Brazil, landless workers in Brazil even. But they still recognize that you're not hitting this white supremacy at the core of USA. You're not going too far, man. You're not going too far. If you can't deal with the police, if you can't deal with control over your police, then all the talk in the world about being a socialist just doesn't mean that much. Can't stop and frisk. What are we talking
Um, I want to discuss with you religion. I've
about?
tried to read some of your works, and the
I
core of what
appreciate
I
it.
understood is that um, you understand religion in some ways as a mode of truth telling, care for the oppressed,
That's
and having the moral courage and conviction to struggle. Um, just to give you a background, I came from an atheistic family, very much opposed to the idea of God. And the Indian context, given it's riddled with the caste system, and given we have the problems of superstition, we grew up, the context is also the 90s, 2000s. India was registering growth, and there was this sort of within middle class, there was this idea that we are moving towards a technology driven society, and science is the bedrock of your beliefs and how you make progress. Some of these things now might sound as crude positivism, etc., etc. Then of course, my deeper dive into Marxism. If in fact, when I became a Marxist, I didn't have that allergy towards religion, because it was also the time I started reading more, and I started to see how religion has in it so many things, and it can be diametrically opposite. It can be the Latin American Jesuit tradition that fights American imperialism, or it can be E.P. Thompson's Methodist Church that tells people how to be poor people, how to be actually be frugal and live under austerity. But to you, I wanted to ask, what is religion for you? Why is it important? And how do you reconcile it with the totality of your thought process?
No, no, indeed. Appreciate that. These questions are just wonderful, though, man. Very much so. Uh, but you go back to the Latin ligare, religare. It means to bind and rebind around the things that one most cherishes. See? And it was distinguished from superstition, going back to Lucretius, because there's ways of binding and rebinding people connected to the thing they most cherish. That's tied to a way of life. It's not just tied to cognitive commitments to various beliefs, you see. Unfortunately, religion tends to be just about whether you believe in God or whether you don't believe in God, if you're an atheist or a theist. Well, no. See, when you think about forms of binding, given structures of feeling and structures of value, to use Raymond Williams' language, are tied to ways that people are constituted and ways in which people are fortified to come to terms with the catastrophes of life, of death, of dread, of disappointment, of disenchantment, of oppression and domination. How do they resist? How do they persevere? How do they endure? Stories, symbols, various things mobilized in order to do that. Now, you know, my dissertation that I wrote almost 45 years ago now at Princeton, it was published by Monthly Review. God bless my dear brother Paul Sweezy and Harry Magdoff. Oh, I miss those brothers. But I miss Fred Jameson too with Social Text. But they published the text, The Ethical Dimension of Marxist Thought. What did I try to do? I tried to tell a story about the development of Marx himself and Kautsky and Lukács and Engels as ethical thinkers, not because ethics is an isolated discipline, but there's an ethical element and an ethical dimension in a Marxist analysis. But because Marx is so rooted to history, he understands ethics as Sittlichkeit in a Hegelian sense. It's ethical communities that bind people together. Any serious Marxist movement or any serious Marxist party is one that has an ethical dimension. If it doesn't, it's just going to get it's going to have a number of left gangsters. They just manipulating power and doing each other in and dominating each other and so forth. No, they're there because they love the people. They're willing to sacrifice for the people. And you see that in Che and so many others. Love is a crucial role here. And Marx was very, very aware of this. And so I've tried to point that out almost 50 years ago now, and I still believe it. But this is true for other traditions as well. The R.H. Tanys, who were Christian socialists, and the Martin Luther King Jr.'s, who were Christian socialists, and the A.J. Musty's, Christian socialists. But then you've got Buddhist socialists. You got Judaic socialists, a whole rich tradition of Judaic socialists, and many of them critical of the of Zionist projects. Many of them not, but many of them too. You see, we just lost the great Arthur Waskow and Michael Lerner and some of the others were very critical in their own very prophetic ways coming out of Judaism. So that in that sense, though, brother, it's I think where we would certainly agree is we would want to always start with historical specificity, context, circumstances, dynamic, changing over time, and people making choices under circumstances not of their own choosing in regard to whether they're going to join freedom movements or maybe what you call justice movements or whatever we want to call them that have to do with empowering poor people and working people. But you have to have analytical tools. Now here, the religious tradition falls on its face. It has no social theories or analytical tool to understand structures of dominations in specific ways. It could talk about greed, it could talk about hatred, it could talk about sloth and a number of other features of all human societies. But you have to have social analytical tools, and that's where social science becomes important. That's where natural science becomes important. There's no such thing as a Christian chemistry, Christian physics, Christian mathematics, no, no. Christian ethics, uh, not. There's no such thing as Christian ethics if you view it as a isolated discipline. There is a thing called ethical dimension of Christian ways of life, just like there's ethical dimensions of Marxist ways of life and Buddhist ways of life and so on, you see. And my hunch is, my brother, that you growing up, you were bumping up against a whole lot of deeply religious folk in the same demonstrations, going to jail together, having interesting conversations. Me and brother Carl Dix, he's atheist to the core, communist to the core. And of course, I'll take a bullet for him. He'll take a bullet for me. And we've been to jail so many times, and we wrestle with all kind of different issues and so forth because we have common orientation toward empowering working people. But he's a serious Marxist, and I'm one who's open to analytical tools and ethical dimensions of the Marxist tradition. But in the end, do view myself as a follower of Jesus.
I want to ask my next question on the non-rational aspect of our life. I mean, on the rational side, whether it's social science or natural science, of course, both social science and natural science tends to be more convincing, at least to me, than the religious tools. But when it comes to things like love, compassion, solidarity, and I suspect there is no way to quantify it. I think the non-rational world that we live in maybe even larger than the rational world, even though the rational world might be more dominating because science, technology, even how public policies, these are dominating spheres of our society. So maybe non-rational world is, it lives under personal interpersonal relations, families, etc. But nevertheless, I wanted to ask you about the limitations of the rational framework to engage with the non-rational. And here, to make my question a little bit more specific, I have been thinking about the utility of Marxian analysis on a piece of art or literary work or music. And what we get is that the Marxian framework can do very well to analyze what is the theme, who is the author or the painter writing or painting about, how is the ruling elite described here, or how are the poor working people described here. So effectively is good at unpacking ideology. Sometimes we can also unpack the whole production process. What is the audience, how much money has gone into it, where does it
Right,
sell,
right.
the mode of exchange.
That's right.
But where it seems to fail for me is the the literary analysis. How are the words strung to each other? What is the tone? What is its uh, power or ability to invoke emotion? Does it touch our raw nerve? And so my question to you, Professor West, is a Marxian framework really adequate to have a literary analysis of the or an analysis of the real literary value, not just ideology and so on, but the literary value, or the artistic value of things like music, piece of art, poem, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, oh Lord, we could have a long seminar on that. Read some Fred Jameson, read some Adorno, read some C.L.R. James, and others, because I would argue that the best of the Marxist analysis is indispensable, but it's inadequate in the end. That he can talk about the conditions and circumstances under which these texts are produced. He could talk about the history inside of the text, be it musical notes in Beethoven or Coltrane or Aretha Franklin, or be it sentences of Joyce or Toni Morrison or Jonathan Swift, because there's history in the text itself, the history of the words, the history of the genre itself, and so forth. But in the end, when it comes to how do you come to terms with death and dread and disappointment, and reflecting on one's own finitude. You see, the assumption of any Marxist analysis is this finitude, this historicity, modes of production, or anything else. And it's true. But the reflection on the nature of the finitude itself. Why do people die? What did Marx do when Jenny died? Walking in the Alps with her picture in the snow, self-destructive. Engels had to go get him. Ooh, I think he should have prepared himself. Should have been fortified for that. But we know love cuts that deep because he loved Jenny. Wasn't always true, but he loved Jenny. We know that. You see, and that's human. And that's just one example among others. Why was Balzac his favorite novelist? Balzac was a royalist, but he talked about class struggle, but he also wrote with power. I think Stendhal's a better writer, but we'd have an argument in our own way. Uh, uh, so when it comes to those things, what you're calling the non-rational, see, for me, I don't really like the binary too much here. I just think human life is constituted by a whole host of a variety of different things. And it's the greed, it's the hatred, it's the resentment, the envy, but also the joy and the ecstasy and the bliss. It's also loneliness and solitude. It's also deep, deep despair sometimes. Now retail despair is different than wholesale despair. Freud in 1918 called mourning versus melancholy, right? You can work through your mourning, but your melancholy, you get stuck. Well, wholesale despair, you get stuck. Retail despair, of course you're going to be despairing when your mama dies or when your daddy dies or when your child dies. My God, that's human. Listen, what's a Marxist analysis of the respond to the death of my mother? Well, you don't go there for that. Marx said, I'm not trying to explain everything. I'm trying to understand the capitalist mode of production and this fetishism of commodities and why these precious workers are being dominated and exploited in this way, given the asymmetric relation of power at the workplace. And I can tell a whole history of that coming out of feudalism. That's the genius of the Marxist tradition. You see what I mean? So you don't want to apply it to things where he himself recognized this is not no all-purpose explanation of everything. What's a Marxist analysis of protons and neutrons? He ain't got nothing to say about that. Leave that to the physicists. So in that sense, I can appreciate Marx in that way. I really can. I really do. So I don't believe, any theory has a monopoly on all of that explanation. Not one theory.
My final question, Professor West. We have been trying our best to increase international solidarity at a time when the divisions have dramatically sharpened, and the U.S. moving further and further into the right. The global South, in particular, has been strangulated. Not that for the first time, but in probably a very naked way. My question to you is if you could share some thoughts about international solidarity. How do we deepen and broaden? Of course, recently the genocide in Palestine have brought together many people, even though that's such a tragedy at one level. Then there are other strengths we have seen in the last 2 decades, at least, the coming together of the Dalit movement in India and the Black movement in the United States together to go beyond national or nationalist frameworks, have kept oppression at the center, freedom at the center of their movement in some kind of an international solidarity to go beyond their elites and the bourgeoisie, if you like. What are some of the things that come to your mind when we are talking about an international community in a radical sense?
Well, I just think we've got to raise our voices as strong as we can, especially for peoples who feel as if they've been completely overlooked and abandoned. That's one of the reasons why the genocide in Gaza is such a turning point, because it strips off any claims about international law, human rights, rule of law. It's very clear that this is barbaric genocide. It's very clear that people wouldn't to say and do anything against precious people, 20,000 precious Palestinian babies. We can go on and on. All the universities, most of the hospitals, and yet no major country or set of countries strong enough to stop it. We've had voices, but we have to even be more intense in that regard. But I would say the same thing about Sudan and trying to keep track of AFRICOM and the various imperial tentacles of the United States and transatlantic countries. I would say the same thing about Haiti. I'd say the same thing about the Latin American countries and Asia too. My God, India. I mean, Modi in some ways, and Trump kissing cousins in a deep way. He's using some of the stuff out of their own textbook, as it were. Uh, so that the solidarity on the international level remains fundamental, though, brother. But we had to be morally consistent too. That is to say that, if we're black, then we have to recognize just how decadent our black bourgeoisies can be. If we're African, we have to recognize how decadent our African bourgeoisie. If we're Muslim, we got to recognize how decadent our Muslim bourgeoisies can be. And similarly, the Jewish and Jewish bourgeoisie, on and on. That kind of moral consistency, that's the kind of internationalism and universalism grounded in particular struggles, the local and the global going hand in hand. It's more important now than ever because fascism and nihilism are the largest ascending movements right now in the world and could end up calling into question the very conditions of the possibility of human life existing. But we shouldn't in any way get discouraged, though, brother. No, 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 no. This is where I fall back on my own tradition, you see. I'm a blues man at the deepest level, man. And the blues is about never denying catastrophe, lyrically expressing that catastrophe in such a way that you artistically transfigure it as a launching pad for voice, for vocation, for virtues like courage, for movements, for attempts to transform the conditions under which those people crying, us crying from our hearts and souls for a better world. Now, that's the kind of utopian element that is never, ever eliminated. No concentration camp, no fascism, no Trump, no Modi, no whatever can ever take that away from us, though, brother. Not at all. And for black folk for 400 years, it's in some ways even a miracle that we here in our right minds, given the level of hatred we've had to come to terms with, and terror, and trauma. And yet we still here swinging, brother. And it don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. That's Duke Ellington. Make dissonance a way of life tied to resistance. It's a beautiful tradition. Each community, each empire, each civilization has its forms of communities resisting. Some of them religious, non-religious, they overlap and so forth and so on. But we just want to accent the moral and spiritual dimensions of it. Very much so. Keep a style and a smile. But brother, this fascism escalating is barbaric, man. You know it and I know it. And we can't try to deodorize it and soften it. We got to tell the truth for what it is.
We'll leave it at at this revolutionary spirit. I will say, Professor West, this was an incredible privilege and a great learning experience to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time.
I salute you, my brother. You stay strong.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.